Have you been diagnosed with lupus and not sure where to turn? Well, I have this 7-day free lupus challenge. Every day you will get in the email one tip that you can implement into your life. Trust me, it's nothing that your rheumatologist has ever told you about. So if you're interested, head on over to margaretromero.com/challenge, sign up, and you will get an email every single day with a tip that will help you feel so much better. Welcome to the Sacred Medicine Podcast. My name is Margaret Romero. I'm a Columbia-trained functional medicine nurse practitioner, and here I uncover the truth behind chronic illness so that you can finally heal. I'm a women's health and hormone expert and love empowering women to finally live their life fully and powerfully through optimal health. This is the Sacred Medicine Podcast. You are listening to the Sacred Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Margaret Romero, and this week we are talking all about hives and headaches and rashes. So in case that is something that you suffer from, because I know a lot of people that have had years and years of this like hives and rashes, and it comes and it goes, and they're on prednisone and they're going to the emergency room. So you got to listen in today, because my guest is Dr. Beverley Rider. She came out with a book called Hives, Headaches, and Heartburn, Heal Your Histamine Hangover. And today you are going to learn so much about some of the symptoms of what histamine hangover really is, how to adopt a low histamine diet, and just why it's so common right now. Why is this such a growing epidemic? I mean, honestly, I would say when I used to work at urgent care, and even in my practice right now, I have patients who get rashes, they have allergies, they get these, headaches, and sometimes it worsens with food. Sometimes they end up in the emergency room because they just don't know what's going on, and they just keep going back and back, and they keep getting the same medications and steroids with really no relief. So if that sounds like you definitely want to listen in today. So without further ado, on to the show. All right, and we are back for another week, and my guest today is Beverley Rider. Thank you so much, Beverley, for being here today.
Thank you.
So you just came out with an amazing book talking all about histamine. And so why don't we start out just by letting people know what it is. We'll go into more specifics, but what is it in general?
Well, what is histamine intolerance? It's actually a funny name because it's not actually an intolerance or a sensitivity to histamine, but an accumulation of histamine to a level that our bodies can't degrade fast enough for various reasons. And there's actually a bucket theory where histamine accumulates in this bucket from various sources, and it fills up and up. And then when our histamine bucket or our tolerance spills over, this can cause reactions that sometimes are typical of histamine, like allergies or sniffly nose or things like that.
Okay. And then, because I have patients who have come in with some form of similar symptoms to this, but I also work in urgent care, so I also am seeing, not necessarily are they having histamine intolerance, but why don't you give us some of the symptoms that are very typical? So maybe whoever's listening could consider this as an issue.
Sure. Well, there's a wide array of symptoms, like it's across the entire body. and so much more than what people typically think of when they think of histamine, which is, like I mentioned, the sniffling, the sneezing. And that's more of a histamine acute reaction, such as the allergy or the anaphylaxis. But there's also more subtle histamine reactions, and often they happen a while after eating a certain food, such as like your nose runs or your ears clog or you get some digestion issues, like a big one is bloating, also gas or stomach pain, diarrhea, constipation sometimes too, or alternating between the two, fatigue, burping, sometimes nausea. And these symptoms are often mistaken for other things like IBS or irritable bowel syndrome or SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or other things. And then symptoms can also happen outside of the gut, like in the skin, for like itching, flushing or red face, eczema, things like that, and even cardiovascular symptoms such as heart palpitations, changes in blood pressure, dizziness, headache, things like that. Also brain fog, inflammation is just generally inflammatory symptoms are usually what we see.
And could you see, what if someone just had bloating, or in order to have an histamine intolerance, do you need to have multiple things going on?
You don't have to have a set necessarily. Usually they happen in a certain system, for example, digestive clusters in that system. So you may eat something and get bloating, diarrhea, gas, upset stomach, heartburn, things like that. But you don't have to have any cardiovascular symptoms or skin symptoms to actually have a histamine intolerance. And I think that answers your question. If you're thinking about what is necessary for a diagnosis, unfortunately, it's not really a diagnosed disease. It's more of an underlying set of symptoms and a mechanism that can help sort of guide your treatment or guide the healing process of lowering or rebalancing that histamine.
I see. Okay. I mean, because so many people have, gas and bloating, or they'll have, this recurrent rash or a little bit of eczema and, just some varied digestive issues. So how do you specifically, how do you diagnose this per se and rule out everything else? Like, when would this be like, oh yeah, this is definitely histamine intolerance?
Mm-hmm. Well, if you go to your doctor, it's really hard to get the doctors in the medical field to talk about these histamine-related issues. In fact, like I said, it's not really an official diagnosis yet, but there are some bright practitioners like yourself who are familiar. But even though there's no definitive test yet, for now, the best test is a little bit of what we call a self-test. And because there's definitely some classic symptoms like allergy-like, bloating, insomnia, rashes. A big one is dermatographia, which is where you scratch the skin and you get these raised red marks that take a while to resolve. These are things that you can look at. So if you take a survey, I actually have one on my website, and if you go through that survey of symptoms and it looks like you do have quite a few symptoms that it fits, then you could do a trial of a low histamine diet. And this would mean you reduce things like fermented foods, alcohol, some typical high histamine foods. And if you benefit from a trial, short-term trial, then this would suggest that the issue could be with histamine. And there are other things to do, such as if you know that antihistamines help these issues, whether it's a prescription antihistamine or even a natural antihistamine, then that would also strongly suggest that the issue is with histamine. And there's a third method, first being a low histamine diet, second antihistamine. Third would be there's actually a supplement called a DAO enzyme, which helps degrade the histamine in your system. If you were to take that enzyme and notice a benefit, that would also suggest it. So these are all inexpensive things to do. It's not like a very expensive medical test that you would have to do to point you in the right direction. And so even if it wasn't histamine intolerance necessarily, lowering and rebalancing your histamine actually would benefit a lot of other conditions, because histamine is known to be involved in things like eczema. Histamine is one of the key mediators, as well as SIBO, and a lot of other things. So you would actually be benefiting on another level from reducing histamine.
Okay, great. And so when you mentioned antihistamine, are you talking about just an over-the-counter medication?
If you, I'm not suggesting to take an over-the-counter medication because it has side effects and can actually slow down the clearance of histamine, but there are some natural antihistamines such as vitamin C and a lot of foods such as arugula and other leafy greens, except for spinach. Spinach is not a natural antihistamine. In fact, can make it worse through, and I can go into that if you like. But these natural antihistamines, and I list a lot of them in my book, can help you rebalance the histamine.
Okay, perfect. Perfect. And I'm just looking here at some of the histamine diet and some of the foods you want to avoid. I just want to name a couple of them.
Okay.
So you mentioned fermented foods and alcohol, but you also have in here like cured meats, salami, sausages, hot dogs, energy drinks, like kimchi, kombucha, which also falls under the fermented foods, eggplant, tomatoes, avocados, things that contain yeast, some dried fruits, gluten, cow's milk. So that's, this is like what people, hot dogs, gluten, milk. Mm-hmm. These are things that people eat a lot of. And so I can see how they're probably just getting like bloated all the time, or maybe live with rashes. And I do see a lot of people that when they come into the clinic that they have sort of like years and years of rashes. Yeah. And so they've just been given steroids and things like that. But yes, you also have a list here on the foods that are also really good for you. So I like that. These are great. These are great. Mm-hmm. Some of them are like ginger, the histamine balancing foods, ginger and garlic, turmeric, olive oil, extra virgin, broccoli sprouts. That's perfect. So there's really no way to test, but you do have this free online survey that people can take, and they can determine, depending on the number that they get, if this is actually an issue for them, right?
Correct. And let me just back up a little bit. There are tests that you could do to get an idea of what's going on, but there's no definitive test that would say for sure that you have histamine intolerance. So you could measure histamine levels in the blood and in the urine, as well as DAO enzyme, which degrades histamine. But these levels are fluctuating all the time and affected by many other things. So it's really hard to look at these numbers during a one-time blood draw or urinalysis and say that it's histamine intolerance. But that's another clue that you could add in if the practitioner was to order those tests. Yes.
Okay, got it. And so why would one person get this and someone else completely not have any issues? Why are some people susceptible and get histamine intolerance?
Yeah, that's a great question. So some people just have a genetic, I don't want to say mutation, it's called an SNP, a single nucleotide polymorphism, in something like their DAO enzyme, which is their diamine oxidase enzyme that is known to clear histamine mainly from the digestive tract. And when you have that defect and that enzyme isn't working as well, then the histamine can build up. This can be likened a little bit to like a lactose intolerance. When someone has a genetic mutation, actually it's reversed. So they have the genetic mutation to be able to digest the lactose with the enzyme lactase. But if you don't have the genetic mutation and you can't digest lactose, then when you consume lactose, then you get a reaction. It's a little bit similar, so that when people don't have the enzyme DAO or a lower level, then they can't degrade histamine as well, and then they end up having an accumulation, filling up that histamine proverbial bucket, and that bucket overflows, and then they get a reaction. So that's one, underlying cause is a genetic defect or polymorphism. And there are many other causes, such as stress. So when someone gets really stressed, their cortisol levels go up, and histamine is known to be linked to stress levels as well as many other types of hormones. So that could be an underlying factor. A big one that I see is gut damage. So the DAO enzyme that I mentioned that degrades histamine is made in the lining of the gut. So when the gut is damaged, say by gluten or an infection or dysbiosis, which is the wrong mix of bacteria in the gut, then those cells can't make as much DAO, and then the person can't degrade as much histamine. So that's a common cause I see. So there's a lot of reasons somebody could have this.
Right. And you also had mentioned things like, toxins, absolutely, mold. There's so much mold, I feel. And people live in mold without knowing that there's mold. Or they may see a little spot in the bathroom and think nothing of it. So I think that mold has just been like a growing, unknowing to so many people. Mm-hmm. I do tend to test for mold in my patients. So even if they tell me, oh yeah, there was a leak, but that was, a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter how long ago it was. If it's still an issue, it's an issue, and it's affecting so many people. So I can see how that. Now, is there a correlation there between mold and DAO, or is it just that mold is affecting the gut, so on and so forth?
Well, it's getting on a little bit more complicated layer, but I can bring in another aspect. So there are cells called mast cells, mm-hmm, which are throughout the body, and these cells, they have histamine inside them stored, ready to be dispatched when there's a threat or a perceived threat. So mast cells are in our skin, our lungs, our digestive tract, and when they sense the mold, they have actually a direct receptor for the mold, and so when they sense it, they dispatch the histamine and a number of other mediators which are inflammatory toward the mold. So that's the most direct way mold can cause increased histamine and inflammation, is through these immune cells that are primed and ready to sense mold. So I would say that's the most common mechanism.
That makes sense. Have you personally been seeing an increase in number of individuals with this histamine intolerance?
Absolutely. I think it's really the next pandemic, if you will. And I think a lot of immunologists like myself, I trained in microbiology and immunology in Canada. And during my PhD, I spoke with a lot of the medical students, and they were taking these classes on how to, or why was this just this increase in allergies that we were seeing across the board, allergies to so many different foods that weren't really allergenic to begin with. And they thought that there was something else going on, and it wasn't true allergy. So when they were doing the true allergy tests, which is an antibody called IgE, nothing was coming up. But these people were really allergic, but they just couldn't figure out why is the IgE not coming up. But there was another mechanism. These mast cells I spoke about have an IgG receptor. They can react to IgE, which is the acute allergy receptor,
Right.
and go on to cause anaphylaxis or hives or other type of typical acute allergy. But the same cells also can sense IgG, which is kind of thought to be a slower reaction antibody. So they can sense these antibodies as well, and as well as a number of other things, and secrete or dispatch this histamine to make an inflammatory response. And this is just, I think a lot of the allergies, what we call pseudo allergies coming up now, are more histamine intolerance and then also mast cell related, but they're not true allergies. But I think there's just such an increase. It's a faster increase than I think even the mold exposure.
Yeah, because, here we've got people with gas and bloating, and suddenly now they've got also, or they have been suffering from hives and sort of some type of red rashes, eczema. And so they go to the doctor, and what's given to them, like typically it's a steroid or something topical, like a topical steroid. And it really isn't being addressed at its core.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So they're still eating the same things. They're still, unless they would most likely be given even an antihistamine, like over the counter or Benadryl or something to that effect.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And the prescription antihistamines, they are actually making the situation worse long term because they downregulate that DAO, important enzyme I mentioned that gets rid of extra histamine. So it's acting in a way that is helpful right away, but then makes it worse down the line.
Got it. And what prescription would that be?
Those would be all the antihistamines. So these are what we call the H1 receptor medications. So there's 4 histamine receptors that we know of so far. And the first receptor, H1R, is the one that's causing the allergies, the hives, the eczema, a lot of things. And the prescription antihistamines block that one receptor, but they don't actually do anything for the circulating histamine in the system. They just block the message going to the cells that are going to react. I don't know if that makes sense, but maybe I can say it in a different way, that basically the cells have a receptor that is looking for histamine that are about to react. The prescription antihistamines block that receptor. So basically it's like plugging your ears to the noise and pretending it's not there, but the circulating histamine is still there.
I see. Okay. And so let's see. So we talked about some of the symptoms, what we can do with diet, what are the high histamine foods, and you also have a list in your book with the foods that are actually good for you.
Yeah, I see on page 32, there's a list of a lot of different foods, of herbs, and even fresh meats are great, but anything aged, preserved, fermented, cured, pickled, things like that, the longer it goes, the more chance the bacteria have to build up and produce histamine.
Okay.
Mhm.
All right, great. And then we also talked about some of the reasons why this happens. And you mentioned gut issues. Stress was a big one, which, of course, when someone's stressed, they usually will have issues with sleep. And then we talked about mold as being a contributing factor that's making this happen.
Mhm.
And medications can also, like consuming lots and lots of medications. I think that's prescription and over the counter, right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
And there's a lot of other causes that are up and coming. It's thought that EMF or electromagnetic radiation or frequency or ERF is having an effect. In fact, there's a researcher in Sweden, Dr. Ole Johansson, who showed that the mast cells in the skin, after being exposed to EMF, were more sensitized and reactive than people that weren't exposed to the EMF. So that's some pretty exciting research coming out of Sweden.
So interesting.
Yeah.
I've been hearing so much lately, about the EMF and what it's actually doing to our bodies.
Yeah. Another big one I see cause is when people take the wrong probiotics, because some probiotics actually produce histamine. They can take histidine, which is an amino acid in our diet, and produce histamine. So when you take the wrong probiotic, that could be throwing fuel on the fire and causing more reactions. But there are probiotics that can actually degrade histamine, which are good.
Which is the probiotic that actually does that? Is there is it a lactobacillus? Is it a bifido? Do you mean something like that?
Yes. So lactobacillus tend to be more histamine producing, but not all of them. Lactobacillus reuteri, bulgaricus are two types that are known to produce histamine, and the ones that are either neutral or beneficial but reduce histamine are the bifidobacteria, Bifidobacterium infantis and Bifidobacterium bifidum, and these are actually have a list in my book. So I actually have a list also, if anyone is interested, on my Instagram site. It's called Histamine Hangover, and I list a lot of the good bacteria and bad bacteria on a couple of posts. So that's a good resource too.
Is that also in your highlights?
I can put it in my highlights. It might be. I don't know, but I can put it in my highlights. It's a great way to highlight
to
it.
sort of to just have that as a. But the post is actually called Histamine Hangover.
The account is Histamine Hangover. That's the handle.
Oh, that's the handle. Sorry, but
yes.
Do you have in there? When was that post? When did you write that post? Was it a long time ago, or was it just recently?
It was over a month ago. But what I can do is put it in the highlights and make sure I highlight it so that it's easier to find.
Okay.
Or repost it. So I can do either of those.
I think you can. You know what? Because I usually, we can talk about this after on how, how to highlight the post.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
That's a good idea, because I get asked that a lot. Where is this post? Or do you have information on this? And so what I usually do is tag people, or I repost it. But what I can do is, another thing I can do is add it to the story for 24 hours. So it'll be up for 24 hours. But then I don't think that's, actually, you're going to have to delete this part because
that's okay.
Humming and awing. So, I think the best thing to do is either repost, but adding to the story, I think, is what I'll do.
Okay.
I'll add it to the story.
So is there anything else that you find that is super important that people should know that we didn't touch upon?
Yeah, big one is estrogen dominance. So women who notice a lot more reactivity during their cycle. So middle of the cycle when estrogen is the highest, so days 12 to 14, as well as just before menstruation, just before the period. This is when the estrogen is higher than progesterone levels, and estrogen directly impacts the mast cells. So mast cells actually have a receptor for estrogen. So when estrogen is high, or with estrogen dominance higher than progesterone and other hormones, then the mast cells can be easily triggered. The mast cells secrete histamine, release histamine, and then histamine then stimulates estrogen levels, and so it's a vicious cycle. So I find that estrogen imbalances is one of the biggest drivers of histamine intolerance as well, whether it's high histamine or high estrogen at certain times of the month, or estrogen dominance overall, just a higher estrogen levels in a ratio situation throughout the period. So balancing estrogen and looking to see, going to practitioner and looking what those estrogen levels are, say through a Dutch test or other test, help a lot of women I see.
Now, do you think that this also counts for women on HRT that are menopausal or postmenopausal?
That's a good question. I've heard it has. I haven't seen it personally, but absolutely, I think that is, it does affect from other people, but I can't say I personally had someone on HRT that I've seen.
Okay. I mean, they would have to be on a lot of like a high dose estrogen, I think. I don't know though. Because estrogen dominance is a very common phenomenon that I have seen. And women don't know, but they don't realize that, like heavy bleeding or lots of clotting, even fibroids can be some of the things that are signs of estrogen dominance, tender breasts, things like that. But unless there was a practitioner that prescribed very high doses of estrogen, with HRT, typically I put women on, we start at low dose HRT. I don't do anything high.
Yeah.
And so I don't think that, I don't know, actually. I've never seen it in practice where I've seen women menopausal who have had this histamine intolerance. Honestly, I've seen it in the younger ages.
Mm-hmm.
And
I do see when the hormones start to bounce around perimenopause, there are a lot of issues.
Yes.
And it's also I've seen a lot of issues with low stomach acid. I know people usually think high stomach acid is a problem, but low stomach acid is also pretty common and can cause a lot of issues. So when you can't fully digest the protein, the other foods that you consume, then those foods can feed the bacteria and the other microbes in the stomach, in the digestive system. And those microbes then produce gas, produce metabolites that trigger the immune system. They can also produce histamine if you have those histamine producers. Candida the yeast can then produce different things like, I don't want to get too much into the biochemistry, but the aldehydes. And the aldehydes can block the DAO receptor and downstream from the DAO, not receptor, enzyme. So the histamine degradation pathway overlaps with the alcohol degradation pathway and candida degradation of metabolites. I don't know if that makes sense, but alcohol, candida, and histamine intolerance is like the worst combination. You're getting three things together that will all make each other worse. So one of the first things that I tell people is just you've got to cut back on the alcohol, especially the bad ones like red wine, champagne. And if you're going to have alcohol, there are better alcohol types, better drinks to have than things like blue curacao or mead or something like that.
So you said alcohol, candida, and what was the third one?
The histamine intolerance. Those three things together
Okay.
tend to be just build on each other and just adding fuel to each other's fires.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. And so, well, that was great. Beverly, thank you so much. I think this has definitely opened people's eyes if they have had these long-standing symptoms and have been on medication after medication and steroid after steroid, that I think this is definitely worth looking into. And quite honestly, I just not sure if, a conventional medicine doc would necessarily be like, yes, this is histamine intolerance.
Definitely not. Yeah, conventional doctors, they don't have a clue. They really don't. I'm married to a physician and a conventional physician, and we talk about this stuff all the time, and you just don't learn it in school. They have no idea.
Yeah.
I was an immunologist, a PhD immunologist, and I didn't know about this. So if I didn't learn about it, then it's just so it's just right under our noses. It's so common. It's so obvious because histamine's been known for over 100 years that we overlook it. And then when I turned around and started looking into it again, it's all right there. And I think people are just starting to notice how powerful it is in a lot of chronic diseases across the board.
Oh, yeah. So much so.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So how can people find you? You did say that your Instagram was Histamine Hangover. That was the name of it. What else? Where else? I'm
on LinkedIn, and then I've got a website, www.rider4health.org. And I can actually email you that if you want. It might be easier, as well as a little bio if that would help. I think you asked for a bio before, and I was in Canada. I didn't get around to it.
Okay, no, I'll put this in the show notes along with everything else that you provide me, and then Instagram, and then we can talk about the highlights and all that.
Okay.
All right, Beverly, thank you so much. I think that this has been definitely a learning experience for so many people listening. I think it's so crucial. It's crucial. I mean, I've known someone that has been in and out of the hospital with head to toe hives. Like, I don't know, why do I get these hives? And then they're just put on steroid. And that's just, it's like a dog chasing its tail. It's just not ever going to get better until you get to the root cause. And it's not only about, I think it's not only about, okay, these are the foods I need to stay away from, which is great. But if you've got these symptoms and you think, and you go on the website and you fill out that survey and you're like, oh my God, I think this is it. I think that doing all the things that you said and you mentioned in the book are awesome. But it's also like you also need to reduce your stress. You also need to sleep really well. You also need to have someone help you with your gut issues. Because you could have a parasite. You can have who knows what, a Pseudomonas or a worm or
pylori.
Exactly.
Pylori or something. But yeah, it's a big cause too.
H. pylori, yes. So I think that it really requires a functional medicine practitioner and definitely picking up your book, which they can find anywhere and on Amazon and all the places.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I don't know about all the places. I haven't been good about putting it out on Goodreads or anywhere else, but I definitely on Amazon. And it's on sale right now because I lowered the price.
Okay, cool. So I'll have all of that in the show notes. Beverly, thank you so much today for sharing your wisdom with all of us.
You're very welcome. There was one more thing I wanted to mention.
Oh, yes.
So I think a lot of people don't do public justice by saying all the foods that are high histamine, the fermented foods, and foods that are otherwise really nutritious and have a lot of nutrients in them. I really believe that it's the processed foods that are the biggest factor, and they're really not highlighted in most people's histamine lists. So the processed foods are inflammatory, and I think that comes earlier. And then it's the regular whole foods, nutritious foods that are kind of like the needle that, or the hay, what do you call it? The straw that broke the camel's back.
Yes.
So it's originally the ultra processed foods that are driving the inflammation that are leading to the histamine intolerance. But that's overlooked by most people.
Oh, yes. For sure. For sure.
Yeah.
All right. Perfect.
Okay. Well, it's great talking to you. And thank you so much for inviting me on. And it's been a pleasure.
You're very welcome.
Such an honor. And you have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Okay. Well, I really hope that opened your eyes to the fact that there's actually a name for this, that it's not just contact dermatitis, which I'm most positively sure that is a diagnosis that you were once given, contact dermatitis, perioral dermatitis. And it is because nobody looks into what actually is going on. So, and prednisone is not the answer. This book will share so much of that. So we did talk about so much today. And if you want to learn more about Beverley, her book, by the way, is on Amazon. So you can definitely pick that up. And to learn more about her, all the links will be in the show notes, margaretromero.com/episode 193. And that's it. One last tip, just so you don't forget. When you combine alcohol and you've got a yeast infection, it's only going to make all of this histamine picture even worse. So I'm just leaving you with that. And also to know that this is not something that you have to live with, because there are solutions to it. It just now has a name. And so that it's not just contact dermatitis. All right. Thank you so much for listening this week. I'll check in with you all next week with my solo episode coming up, and hope wherever you are in the world, you are happy, you are safe, and you are healthy. Bye for now.